American Sign Language, or ASL, is one of many sign languages used primarily by deaf and/or mute people to communicate. It is not, as many unfortunately believe, a form of pantomime, which is to say you cannot understand what people who use ASL are saying unless you first learn the language. And if you need any proof of this, you might observe that the United States, England, and Australia, despite all speaking English, have deaf communities with different sign languages: American Sign Language, British Sign Language, and Auslan, and deaf people from these different countries can't communicate with each other without first learning each other's languages. But where did ASL come from? How was it created, and by who? At first it sounds a lot like something one or two individuals would single-handedly make up, similar to something like Braille, but the truth is much more complicated. The first thing you need to realize is that sign languages don't need to be created intentionally, they just tend to happen on their own wherever there are deaf people, and after that they tend to evolve, split, and mix with each other in exactly the same way spoken languages do. It's been recorded many times that when deaf children grow up in a house, even with hearing people in it, they will tend to make up their own sign languages, or at least some simple form of gestural communication. But when there's a lot of deaf people who all live in the same place, the deaf people will end up combining their various home sign languages to create a village sign language. This is exactly what happened in Paris, and we're not exactly sure when it formed, but in 1779 a deaf bookbinder named... French orthography is scary. I'm gonna go with Pierre Desloges. Anyway, he published a book which, besides possibly being the first book published by a deaf person, described a flourishing sign language in Paris at the time, so we know it existed at least by then. But despite the fact that we know Parisian Sign Language was a thing beforehand, there is a common myth that a guy named... This video is gonna be full of names like this, isn't it? I'm just gonna call him Épée. This guy is often credited as inventing sign language, but he did no such thing. Rather, he learned sign language from deaf people in Paris, and then used that sign language to teach them in a school he founded. The first ever public school for deaf people, called the... well, yeah. Anyway, Épée tried to modify Parisian Sign Language to make it more grammatically similar to French, in part by adding a bunch of signs for various grammatic features, but the thing he created was completely unusable because of how complicated it was, and never had much of an effect on Parisian Sign Language. But what does any of this have to do with ASL? Well, the history of ASL begins with the meeting of two people in England in the early 1800s. One was a deaf faculty member of the Parisian School for the Deaf I mentioned, named... Lord Clare, I think? And this other guy named... Oh, come on! You're from America! Why do you have a name like that? You know what? I give up. I'm going to call him Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. So anyway, Gallaudet had come to England to study methods of teaching deaf students, but he wasn't very convinced by what he saw in England, which, by the way, didn't involve sign language. While he was there, though, he met Laura Clare along with the head of the school in Paris, and he went back with them to Paris to study the methods they used there instead. He was much more impressed with this, and he convinced Laura Clare to come back with him to America to help him found a school for the deaf there. While on the way there, the two worked together to modify Parisian Sign Language to be more like English grammar. At the time, both of them still thought of sign language as a signed form of spoken language, when in fact Parisian Sign Language was completely different from French grammatically, and ASL ended up being very different from English grammatically. Despite this, the two created the American School for the Deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, and they taught their modified Parisian Sign Language to the students there. However, the students who came there often came from places in the US that had a lot of deaf people in them, and that had developed their own village sign languages the same way Paris did. Most famously, the sign language of an island off the coast of Massachusetts called Martha's Vineyard, but they also brought influence from the sign languages of Henniker, New Hampshire, and Sand River, Maine. These native sign languages mingled with the Parisian Sign Language that Gallaudet and Lord Clare had brought over, and it was from this mixture that ASL was born. After the American School for the Deaf, more schools in the US for deaf people opened, and ASL spread to them too. Today, ASL is used by hundreds of thousands of people all over the world, and the language has evolved a lot since its beginnings, but 58% of the signs in ASL are still cognates with French Sign Language, indicating that the dominant form of sign language in America is primarily descended from Old Parisian Sign Language, all because of two guys who brought it over on a boat 200 years ago.